Clothing is an intrinsic part of being human, letting us express who we are, what groups we belong to, what jobs we do, and so on. And clothes let us live in specific environments, providing warmth or cooling depending on where we are. It's almost always part of our everyday routine. So it's hardly surprising then that clothing would accrue some folklore. Some specific items foretold your future married bliss, other items associated you with the dead, and yet others provided a handy escape from the fairies should you need one. So after looking at the folklore of footwear last week, let's have a look at the folklore of clothing on this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are cracking on with February's theme, which is the folklore of clothing. And we did shoes last week, and it's really annoying. I keep coming up with extra ones now, but I'm not going to go back and add to them because, we can always come back and revisit themes at a later point in time, if necessary. So this week we're going to have a look at more sort of general everyday clothes. So we're going to have a look at outerwear, which is things like coats and whatnot. But you probably figured that out yourself. We're going to have a look at them and accessories, which covers all the sorts of things like hairpins and belts and hats and gloves and so on, sort of after that as well. So that's kind of how I've divided everything up because it just seemed like the most logical way of doing so. So we're just going to crack on because I came across a lot for clothing and this isn't even really just scratching the surface. But again, I like to try and keep these episodes short, so I don't want to end up going on for like 45 minutes talking about, well, clothes really. But we're going to start off with probably the most common belief that I've found about clothing and folklore in terms of its relationship to fairies and so on, and that's the practice of turning your clothes inside out. Because if you found yourself lost while you were out and about, and you believe that you'd been pixie-led, so basically you'd been led off the beaten track and fairies had kind of taken you away from where you were supposed to be, you'd turn your jacket or petticoat inside out to break the charm. And I know I said we'd do outerwear next week, but I thought I'd put this in this one because of the fact it could really be any item of clothing that you were wearing. And in some places, people actually turned their clothes inside out before they went anywhere that was suspected of being a favourite of pixies to try and avoid getting pixie-led in the first place. But it actually extends beyond the idea of the fairies because there was also a practice in Yorkshire of smock turning, in which the wives or girlfriends of those who worked at sea would actually turn their smocks inside out to help ensure a good wind and success for their partners. And also there was a belief that if you'd put your clothes on inside out by accident, then you should actually leave them that way, because if you turned them back the right way, that might turn your luck too. Now that belief was even recorded as late as 1988, so it does appear that that one might have stuck. So please do let me know if that is something that you've come across, the idea that if you've put something on inside out, you have to leave it inside out for the rest of the day. There was another interesting one around the idea that you shouldn't mend clothes while you were wearing them, because part of the belief was that people would speak ill of you if you had clothes mended while you were wearing them. And in other places, the belief was a bit more specific, saying, if you mend your clothes on your back, you will live much money to lack. And elsewhere, people thought that they would stitch sorrow to themselves if they mended an item of clothing while wearing it. Now, while it might sound strange, and of course, in some cases it would be easier to leave the thing on in order to fix it. So, for example, if you're trying to darn a hole in a sock, putting the sock on means that you're going to at least maintain the right level of tension for then darning it. But apparently, according to folklore, this is a no-no. And a woman in 1987 who was questioned about it suggested that it might have something to do with sewing a shroud. And this could help to explain the origin of the belief from a time when people perhaps made their own shrouds. So sewing a hem or darning a sock might seem fairly innocuous, but if you did so while wearing it, then it might have suggested the idea of sewing up your own shroud while you were inside it. And speaking of shrouds, there was also a general distaste towards wearing clothes that had belonged to someone who had died. In the 19th century, if a person died and their clothes were given to the poor, people might say, and I quote, they may look very well, but they won't wear, they belong to the dead, end quote. And the belief was that the dead continue to own their clothing, and this meant that the poor wouldn't actually say thank you for any clothes they were given from a person who died. And it does seem to have come from a belief that the clothes would rot as the dead person rotted, which is why they wouldn't wear, because obviously they would disintegrate as well. And this in a way is a form of sympathetic magic in which whatever happens to one thing happens to whatever represents it. So here the clothes represent the dead person. So what happens to the dead person then happens to the clothes as well. And of course, the trouble with folklore is it's always full of contradictions. So there was also a belief that you would inherit a legacy if you wore a dead man's clothes. And if you wore a dead woman's clothes, it meant that you would get a change of job. So it wasn't always entirely necessarily deemed to be a bad thing to do. Other people thought that the relatives could wear the clothes of the dead if the dead person had had a new suit. But there was one caveat: they couldn't alter the clothes because that would invite bad luck. And one old belief claimed that you had to be laid out in at least one new piece of clothing if you died suddenly, so that you would appear well dressed to other ghosts. And I love that one, because I love the idea that people are making sartorial choices for the afterlife while they're still alive. But that said, if a sick person picked out their clothes that they wanted to be buried in, then they actually wouldn't die. So that seems quite a helpful one to remember. Now, in Wales in the Middle Ages, people tried to buy the clothing of monks to bury their dead in because evil spirits couldn't interfere with corpses that were thus dressed. And indeed, people also made sure not to bury anyone with their name on their clothes. I'm not entirely sure the reason why for that one. I'm assuming they mean the name of the dead person on their clothes. But that was indeed the belief. And this takes us from funerals and so on to other special occasions, and there was a belief in Northern England and Scotland that the baby must sleep in the clothes in which it was christened, because apparently this would bring good health to the baby. But meanwhile, it was bad luck to fall in love with your partner while wearing mourning clothes, because doing so meant you would never marry them. And my favourite one is that actors would wear old clothes on opening night of the theatre to assure a good run. And I am considering doing a whole episode just on theatre folklore, so do let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. But when it comes to clothes in a specific time of year, the big one seems to be Easter. And it was considered good luck to wear your best clothes on Easter Sunday. People needed to wear something new on the day or they would have bad luck for the rest of the year. And a surprising number of the superstitions seem to include the bad luck being pooped on by a bird, which, is bad luck, yes. But it was fascinating that people were so desperate to avoid that. Now, the particular belief in wearing good clothes for good luck actually appeared in an advert on the 13th of March in 1970 in the Bath Chronicle, which actually reminded people it was lucky to wear something new at Easter, which I guess if you're selling clothes is an incredible ad campaign to run with. And for some people, you should actually wear 3 new things at Easter to bring luck for the remaining year. It doesn't say what they are, so I suppose they could be relatively small. So I dare say you could probably pick up something relatively cheaply in a charity shop or something like that. And I also don't know if it has to be brand new or just new to you. It doesn't necessarily specify, so... But wearing new clothes before Easter was a bad sign, as referenced in Romeo and Juliet in the line, "Didst thou not fall out with a tailor for wearing his new doublet before Easter?" So I'm assuming that they just basically mean getting new clothes and then wearing it before Easter Sunday. So if you can hold off until Easter Sunday, you can see what happens. Now, new clothes in general have a little bit of folklore associated with them anyway, because people in Dorset believed that clothes would last twice as long if you wore them for the first time on a Sunday, and you should never put them on for the first time on a Friday. This probably comes from the idea of people having their Sunday best, and of course if you only wore your Sunday best on a Sunday, then yes, I'm sure they would obviously then last longer. That's possibly where that one comes from. But if you wore something new for the first time, someone else should wish you, and I quote, "health to wear it, strength to tear it, and money to buy another," end quote. Now, what I find really funny about this one is my mother has actually wished people the health to wear something new my whole life. So you get a new pair of shoes, I wish you the health to wear them. Get a new coat, I wish you the health to wear it. And so on, you get the idea. And she was quite fascinated to learn the latter part of the phrase about having the strength to tear it and the money to buy another while I was researching this post, because when I came across it I was like, "Oh, Ma'am, you'll never guess what I've just found." But according to the Oxford Dictionary of Superstitions, apparently it was a common blessing in Northumberland, which might explain its appearance in my family, particularly given my mum's ancestors all kind of come from either Scotland or the Northumberland area. And also, and I love this one, spotting a spider on someone's clothes is a sign that they'll buy new clothes. Now, I know some people who hate spiders so much, I dare say they would buy something new to replace whatever the spider had been crawling on, but I don't think that that's what the superstition is referring to. And it wouldn't be a Fabulous Folklore episode without mentioning a form of love divination. And I won't lie, I've come across so many of them now, I am actually really tempted to actually write just a short book about them. And naturally, I will test them, for science. But anyway, this particular one we have sort of covered a little bit before, but I thought I'll cover it again just for anyone who hasn't heard the earlier episodes. But hanging up a smock so it could be turned by a vision of your future husband was quite a popular practice, obviously as a form of divination. And in one version from 1685, Scottish women would dip their smocks in water running south on Halloween, and then they would hang them up to dry so that their future husbands could turn them before the fire. Elsewhere, women follow this practice on Midsummer's Eve or St. Mark's Eve, and in some versions of the practice you were actually supposed to hang the smock and sit up until your intended's apparition arrived, in others you went straight to bed. Now by the mid-19th century, a variation saw young women actually turning their chemise inside out and then hanging that on a hedge, and then they would basically sit and watch to see what happened, and whoever came along and turned it the right way out would then be their future husband. I can't help thinking that's possibly not the best way to find a new partner, by leaving what is essentially an undergarment outside and seeing who will interfere with it, for want of a better word. But there we go. And now I've got a big collection of clothing superstitions to end the episode. So let me know if you actually know any of these or indeed practice them. But it was important not to wear a garment bearing bloodstains made by a clumsy tailor, or to touch a handkerchief that had been lost by someone else, because both of these things would bring bad luck. Why you would pick up somebody else's used handkerchief is absolutely beyond me, but there we go. That said, if you made your own clothes and pricked your finger, and then obviously thus getting blood on the fabric, you could expect lots of kisses the first time you wore the garment. Ironing or starching a shirt tail would make its wearer grumpy, I'm presuming not while they were wearing it, and you shouldn't iron the back of an item of clothing, again to avoid bad luck. If you wear green a lot, you'll become rich. Again, I suppose this is a form of sympathetic magic, because obviously in many places paper money is green, although not all. And if your dress tears along the seam, you've got a secret enemy. But if you burn a hole in your dress, it means luck is on the way. And you should also hang your clothes up at night to attract luck. And the idea was that if you just dropped your clothes on the floor, you were dropping your luck. I have a feeling that was invented by someone who was really sick of picking other people's clothes up. But that's my own personal theory on that one. You shouldn't throw clothes in the fire, or you too will die in a fire, which seems a little bit extreme. But picking up any clothing that you find lying around would bring sickness. Again, I dare say somebody's brought that up to basically stop themselves from having to pick up other people's clothes. Wearing a new dress for the first time on a rainy day or during a waning moon would bring bad luck. And wearing somebody else's clothes would bring their problems onto you. Now, if you want to get a lot of wear out of your clothes, you just simply keep a piece of iron in your pocket. And of course, obviously, there is the episode which looks at the folklore of iron when we did the folklore of metals. If you buy a dress on New Year's Day, then be assured you'll always look great in it. And don't get dressed again if you've already gotten undressed for bed, or it'll bring bad luck. If the hem of your skirt accidentally got turned up throughout the day, it would bring you good luck. And that said, if anyone could see your petticoat below the hem of your dress, it meant that your father loved you more than your mother. And most commentators seem to think that's because a loving mother would apparently pay attention to the length of your hem, but we're going to ignore the outdated gender dynamics there. Now, after the Second World War, the accidental showing of the petticoat did become a slightly different thing, and it became subject to a range of comments from others, such as having total strangers telling you your washing is hanging out. But by the 1950s, women actually believed that other women showing their petticoat were husband hunting, in a rather stunning example of women basically putting other women down. Now, let's agree, clothing folklore is odd at best. Many of these superstitions and beliefs really do no longer hold sway, and items of clothing really do fall out of favour as fashions change, so some of these don't necessarily make sense, because how many people do you know who still wear petticoats, you know what I mean? So certain things people just don't really wear now. And obviously with more people buying clothes than making them, we're also somewhat divorced from their production now. But even now, how many of us have a lucky piece of clothing? I mean, I've got a dress that I absolutely love to bits, but I no longer wear it on dates, because after I wore it on 3 first dates, each one of them, I ended up where the guy would then cancel the planned second date at the last minute and then disappear altogether. Now, I can't really blame the dress for that kind of behaviour, but part of me doesn't want to tempt fate by wearing it again, so I kind of keep it for other occasions instead. And indeed, look at the people who wear a particular pair of underpants or a particular t-shirt whenever their favourite sports team plays. Usually this is born out of that weird sort of sense of coincidence that perhaps the team won when you wore a particular combination of clothing, so you feel you have to do it again to bring them luck and so on. And I suppose with superstitions like these, they're largely harmless, they don't really hurt anyone, and, you know, you're going to obviously remember the times when it worked and forget the times when it didn't, just thanks to confirmation bias. So we can often reinforce these superstitions for ourselves. And this can also explain why you might have that superstition of you wear a new dress for the first time and it rains, and then every subsequent time you feel like it rains, but obviously it might not. It's just you'll only remember the ones that do. Human psychology is a wonderful thing, people. But I do think that there is something to be said for the way that people have brought clothing into everyday practices, because it is something that obviously most of the time we're wearing. Obviously we end up with quite personal attachments to things. Obviously in some cases we've made it ourselves, so there's that extra level of association. So I think it's hardly surprising that clothing would have so many superstitions, and they're nearly always to do with luck as well. You notice there's not as much about warding off evil and so on as there was with the footwear. But ultimately, you could follow all of these superstitions and try and guarantee yourself the best day possible. So if anyone tries that, again, please do let me know, because then it's folklore in action. But I hope you enjoyed that particular episode and our fabulous collection of superstitions and beliefs and so on. And a lot of them are actually really easy to try for yourself. So, you know, maybe you want to have a go and see how you get on. Next week, we're going to have a look at the accessories one. So that's going to be like gloves and hats and things like that. So they're kind of things which you might wear in a slightly different way or only occasionally. And as I say, we'll round out the month with outerwear. I do want to quickly remind anyone who might be in or around London on 11th of April that I am doing a special extended class with the Miskatonic Institute looking at water in British folklore in all its forms. So water deities, water monsters, all that kind of thing. So if you are around, it would be brilliant to see you there and to actually meet some of you in person. So the link to the tickets and what we're actually covering and what have you is all in the show notes below. And also, I would recommend anybody who really is interested in folklore and myth and magic and so on, and I'm going to assume that you do because that's why you're here, to actually check out the work of the Centre of Folklore, Myth and Magic in Tonbridden. Now, I'm actually one of the directors, so I should really be upfront about that, but at the same time, I think what Holly has built is absolutely fabulous. She's got a series of in-person talks and things like that. So I'll put the link in the show notes and you can see how you can get involved with folklore and so on. And obviously there's also the Folklore Library and Archive as well, run by Mark Norman, friend of the podcast, who also runs the Folklore podcast. And he's basically doing this wonderful work, actually preserving folklore for researchers and things like that as well. And I've also put the link to that in the show notes. So if you are looking for where to take things further, those would be two brilliant places to start. But I'll leave it there, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.